Welcome to the Daily Dispatch. First up, Pakistani steel producers warn of shutting down their industrial units if the issue of the letters of credit is not resolved. Next, we'll tell you about the alarming report of over 130,000 people having been dismissed from their jobs in the big tech and media companies in the last 1 year. And also on the Dispatch, we'll tell you about a dark chapter in Canadian history and the recent actions regarding the treatment of children at residential schools and the mass unmarked graves between the 1800s and 1900s. We're here to give you the news and to help you infer the world around you. I'm Tayyaba Nasar Khan, and here is your Daily Dispatch. A major player of the steel manufacturers in Pakistan, the Pakistan Association of Large Steel Producers, has warned the government of possible industrial shutdown unless the state bank clears the letter of credit. The steel manufacturing industry, which relies on zero subsidies from the government, is unable to procure raw materials to carry out the uninterrupted operation of the manufacturing. The association has warned that the inability to procure due to absence of the LC clearance will result in a grinding halt to the industry. Now, State Bank of Pakistan, in the backdrop of the fast depleting foreign exchange reserves, has suspended the clearance of the letters of credit, LC, to Pakistani businesses, which rely on finished import products or raw materials or parts for the production of their products. The steel industry imports raw materials worth $100 million, which is hardly 2% of Pakistan's import bill. Now, the import of steel scrap is down by a record 55% year-on-year for December, which was the sharpest year-on-year drop in the last 10 years. The total exports in the last fiscal year stood at $800 million. In order to alleviate the hard crunch in businesses, the State Bank has asked private banks to offer one-time facilitation to importers who can extend their payment beyond the 180 days or arrange funds from abroad to settle their pending import payments. The decision comes after the business community, in a previous community hall meeting, criticized the SBP governor, Jamil Ahmed, for not clearing the 5,700 containers carrying food, medicines, and industrial raw materials lying at the port for months. If the existing issue is not resolved in the next 4 days, the industry has warned that, as per estimates, over 7 million people associated with the industry will be unemployed. Industry leaders fear this will push de-industrialization in the country. Previously, it is important to mention that members of the Textile Association had earlier warned that nearly 0.7 million people lost jobs in the sector. Analysts in separate analysis have warned that if the slump in growth will continue throughout 2023, Pakistan may experience annual growth of 2%, and unemployment may hit 6.02 million, which is 8.5% of the total workforce of 73 million people. However, experts also fear that this number can be higher due to the underreporting of unemployment statistics in the informal sector. Now let's talk about one of the consequences of inflation around the world. Talking more about the inflation, especially in the US now. After a wave of layoffs in the tech sector, with Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and Twitter letting go of thousands of their employees in recent months, a similar trend is being witnessed in the giant media houses. Recently, Vox Media announced that it would cut 7% of its staff, citing the economic uncertainty and their inability to sustain the projects and investments that have not performed as expected. As ad spending in the sector drops, media houses are shedding their workforce to reduce the costs. Last month, CNN reportedly undertook its biggest workforce cut in a decade, laying off around 1,000 employees. The Washington Post first eliminated its print edition and then announced to reduce its newsroom workforce by 10% in 2023. Moreover, the Associated Press is making its staff take early retirement in lieu of the financial incentives. These developments take place as ad spending saw a decline due to the slow economic growth and competition from streaming services increased. While the traditional media houses tried to jump on the bandwagon of streaming services themselves, making broadcast new media relatively less significant as a tool to generate viewership and therefore more revenue. Another reason that is being attributed to these layoffs is consolidation taking place in the media industry, with two companies merging together or one company taking over another and then carrying out a reduction in the workforce to cut the costs. For example, when last year the Vox Media merged with the Group 9, a lifestyle publisher, it became one of the world's biggest digital media houses, and it immediately cut off 3% of its workforce. According to Atlantic Magazine, over 130,000 people have been dismissed from their jobs in big tech and media companies in the last 1 year. As economic uncertainty persists, a radical shift towards the non-traditional sources of news and entertainment continues apace, and competition increases in the streaming sector. It is feared that these layoffs will continue in the future. We'll now tell you about a dark chapter in Canadian history and the recent actions. The Canadian government has settled a lawsuit that resolves a class action brought in 2012 by 325 First Nations seeking compensation for the erosion of their cultures and languages. The settlement of 2.8 billion Canadian dollars will be given over to a trust fund that operates independently from the Canadian government and will work towards the conservation of the Indigenous culture. Now, Canada has been under fire for the systemic erasure of the Indigenous culture and the treatment of children at these residential schools that the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were made to attend for decades. Thousands of children were forcibly taken into assimilation centers, often run by the Roman Catholic Church between the 18 and 1900s. Last year, Pope Francis apologized for the role of church in the horrors that the Indigenous people have been made to suffer. Unmarked graves are also being discovered on the grounds of these schools through ground penetration radar, and thousands of graves have been discovered on the grounds of these schools in the past 2 years. Archaeologists studying the lands have also concluded that the shallow depth of some of the graves could indicate that children were made to dig them. Thousands of children are estimated to have died in these schools from hunger, illness, malnutrition, and neglect, not to mention the physical and sexual abuse. Survivors recall instances of violence, regular corporal punishments, and psychological abuse in the process of assimilating the Indigenous children into the Canadian society. Now, Canadian leadership has lately been accepting of the dark chapter in Canadian history, and in 2020, announced over 40 billion Canadian dollars in reparations for the erasure of Indigenous languages and identities. As this new settlement comes around, along with higher decision-making power for Indigenous leadership on new development projects, Canada seems to be making amends. While Indigenous leaders decry the delay in recognition of Canada's involvement in genocide, they welcome the realization and acknowledgement as a good first step to reconciling the historical experience of Indigenous people and the excesses exacted by a settler colony. The details of the $2 billion settlement will be released later, and the disbursements and allocation of the funds will be decided by the end of February. Next on the dispatch. In a hate crime on the eve of Lunar New Year celebrations, about 10 people were killed by a gunman in Monterey Park, California in the United States, where approximately 65% of its 59,000 population identifies Asian. The suspect, a roughly 70-year-old Asian man, was then found dead in his van by a self-inflicted gun wound. This attack was the 33rd incident of a mass shooting, or what the FBI calls it, an active shooter incident. The United States has seen 345 active shooter incidents from 2000 to 2020. The US has seen an uptick in firearm-related violence as well, with about 45,000 Americans dying due to the violence in 2021 alone. 2020 was the deadliest year for US in gun violence since 1993, with 43% of the total deaths being homicides, a 34% increase from 2019 and a 75% from the previous decade, placing the US at the top of the gun violence table among all developed countries. Now, despite having 5% of the global population, the US accounts for 46% of the global civilian gun ownership. The right to keep and bear arms is enshrined in the Second Amendment of the US Constitution. And many in the US, despite an active debate on the gun laws, are strong proponents of gun ownership, with the National Rifle Association being the most powerful lobby in the US politics. The gun rights groups have increased their spending on the pro-gun ownership laws more than the gun control groups, which puts the issue in a state of a limbo. With the gun violence and mass shootings increasing, the debate over gun laws seem to remain in deadlock, which will make it hard to counter not only the fatalities, but also the indirect damage, including related to psychological damage and more events of mass shootings. including that of children. We'll take you to Latin America now, where Brazilian and Argentinian presidents Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Alberto Fernandes made a case for economic integration between the two South American nations. The two leaders discussed easing the trade regulations and discussed the possible use of South American currency for bilateral trade. The use of a common currency is expected to reduce the costs and reduce external vulnerabilities, while it is used for financial commercial flows between the two countries. The new currency is expected to be discussed at a summit in Buenos Aires, which could boost the regional trade and reduce reliance on the US dollar. The new currency is likely to be called Sur, meaning South. Now, the currency is expected to be rolled out between Argentina and Brazil first, and then later in the other South American countries. The idea was floated by the Brazilian leadership last year, and President Lula is noted to have floated the idea during his presidential bid as well. Argentina happens to be Brazil's largest trading partner. Brazil is also set to return to the community of Latin America and Caribbean states, which it left under the watch of Bolsonaro in 2019, citing objections to the participation of both Venezuela and Cuba. Brazil is one of the highest foreign exchange reserves in South America, standing at $362 billion. Brazil's foreign exchange dramatically picked up after the year 2005. Guyana, on the contrary, has the lowest foreign exchange reserves in the region at $548 million. While Argentina's foreign exchange reserves stand at $32.2 billion, Argentina in the early 2000s reeled under the pressure of an economic slump and defaulted its debt after a balance of payment crisis. And lastly, according to the United Nations Staff Union, the year 2022 saw 32 members of the United Nations peacekeeping missions killed in deliberate attacks against them, which included 7 Pakistanis, 6 of whom were killed in a helicopter crash in East Congo, and another in an attack on the mission's operational base. The United Nations peacekeeping mission saw the deadliest attacks in Africa. The 32 deaths added to the 494 killed in the last 13 years in different UN peacekeeping missions. Pakistan remains the 5th highest contributor to peacekeeping missions and forces, with both men and women participating actively. Since the 1960s, when the UN peacekeeping mission was established, Pakistan has contributed over 200,000 peacekeepers in 43 different missions and lost 157 of the peacekeepers. The United Nations peacekeeping mission aims to use effective tools to help the countries torn by conflict navigate back to the path of peace. The mission works on 3 principles: consent of all parties, impartiality, and the non-use of force except for self-defense. There are currently 12 peacekeeping missions in Africa, Asia, and Europe. That's all, folks. We'd be happy to receive your feedback and suggestions. We'll be back tomorrow with more bite-sized news that keeps you up to date with what's happening in the country, the region, and the globe. I'm Tayyaba Nisar Khan, and this was your Daily Dispatch.